Henry Vogel had 41 days left before the bank would take the north 40 acres, and he had not told a single member of his family. What his grandson Caleb didn't know yet was that a letter, sealed 30 years ago, was already waiting in the ground to answer a question nobody had thought to ask. The smell that meant home to Caleb was diesel exhaust, cooling in April air, mixed with wet clay and the particular sweetness of last year's hay going soft in the loft. He was 24, back on his grandfather's farm outside Loyal, Wisconsin, after the marketing job in Milwaukee had folded along with the agency that gave it to him, and after the apartment he could no longer afford had folded right along with it. He told himself he was only staying through planting season, long enough to save some money and figure out the next thing. He told himself a lot of things that spring that turned out not to be entirely true. His grandfather, Henry, was 78 and built like a fence post that had weathered 50 winters and refused to lean. He had farmed this land since he was younger than Caleb was now, had buried his wife, Eleanor, on the hill behind the house 12 years ago, and had never, in Caleb's entire life, needed help doing anything. That was what made this spring different. Caleb noticed the way you notice a floorboard that never used to creak, that his grandfather's hands shook a little now when he laced his boots, and that he sat down twice on the porch steps before he made it all the way up them. There was a tin box that had sat on the mantel above the wood stove for as long as Caleb could remember. Dented army green with the initials WV scratched into the lid in a hand that wasn't his grandfather's. Caleb had asked about it as a boy and been told, gently but firmly, that it wasn't his to open. He had stopped asking sometime around age 10, the way children stop asking about things that are clearly walled off, filed under Grandpa's business, and left alone. Caleb also remembered, in the particular way memory holds onto things it doesn't yet understand the importance of, a second detail from that same childhood: his grandmother's reading glasses, which had sat folded on the windowsill above the kitchen sink for 12 years since her death, never moved, never dusted away, as if someone in the house still expected her to come looking for them. Henry never spoke about her directly, not in complete sentences anyway, but Caleb had noticed over the years how his grandfather's hand would sometimes rest on that windowsill a beat too long while doing dishes, the way you'd rest a hand on someone's shoulder, without meaning to draw attention to it. What Caleb had never stopped noticing, though, was the last Saturday of April. Every year, without fail, his grandfather rose before first light, walked alone to the same unmarked spot at the edge of the north field where the old oak had come down in a storm decades back, and dug a hole. He would be gone 40 minutes. He would come back with dirt under his nails and the tin box tucked under one arm, and he would not speak of it, not that day, not any other day. Caleb had asked exactly twice in his life what his grandfather buried out there every spring. Both times, Henry had looked at him with something that wasn't quite sadness and said, "Someday you'll understand, and it won't be from me telling you." Then the subject was closed like a gate latching shut. This spring, the ritual was about to break its own rules for the first time. Caleb woke that April morning to an empty house and a note on the kitchen table in his grandfather's cramped handwriting: "Gone to check the fence line. Back by 7. It was 6:40. Caleb knew, the way you know your own name, that his grandfather had gone to the oak stump instead, because it was the last Saturday of the month, and because the tin box was missing from the mantel. He told himself he wasn't going to follow. He told himself that for about 4 minutes, standing at the window with his coffee going cold, before he pulled his boots on over bare feet and went out into air still silver with morning fog. He didn't follow all the way. He didn't need to. He'd known the spot since he was 7 years old, had ridden past it on his bike 1,000 times without a second thought. The way you ride past a headstone in a cemetery you've walked through your whole life. He came at it from the tree line instead, staying back where the fog and the brush would hide him, and watched his grandfather kneel at the base of the dead oak's roots with a spade and a shovel and dig, alone, the way he'd been doing every spring since before Caleb was born. What Caleb saw next was the thing that changed the shape of the whole spring for him. His grandfather wasn't just digging a fresh hole. He knelt at the edge of an old one, already reopened, and lifted something out of the earth before he put anything new in, a shape wrapped in oilcloth and twine, roughly the size of a shoebox, dark with dirt and age. Henry held it in both hands for a long moment, head bowed, the way a man holds something at a funeral. Then he set it aside, dug the hole a little deeper, and lowered a new bundle down to the ground, along with something small and pale that Caleb couldn't identify from that distance. He covered it, tamped the earth flat with the back of the shovel, and knelt there another minute with his hand pressed flat against the disturbed soil, like he was checking a fever. Then he stood, tucked the old retrieved bundle under his arm next to the tin box, and started back toward the house. Caleb had exactly 4 seconds to decide whether to be seen, and he chose to duck lower into the brush instead, heart going harder than the walk back should have justified. That night, Caleb told himself 3 different stories about what he'd watched, and none of them let him sleep. The first story was money. Cash his grandfather didn't trust in a bank, especially not now. With the note about the North 40 he'd found folded and refolded so many times, it had gone soft at the creases, tucked half under a stack of unpaid feed invoices on the kitchen desk. The second story was worse. Medication or paperwork about a diagnosis nobody in the family had been told about. Something Henry was hiding, the way proud old men hide the exact things that would make their families worry. The third story didn't have words yet. It just had the shape of his grandfather's shoulders, bowed over a hole in the ground, like he was greeting an old friend or apologizing to one. None of them knew it yet, but the shape in his grandfather's arms held 30 years of a promise nobody outside that oak stump had ever been told existed. And the next 6 weeks were going to force it into the light whether Henry Vogel was ready or not. The bank letter surfaced 2 mornings later, not because Henry showed it to anyone, but because Caleb went looking for the checkbook to pay the propane bill and found, underneath it, a certified letter from First Farmers Trust with a due date circled twice in red pen. 41 days, it said, before the bank moved to foreclose on the North 40, unless the outstanding balance, $18,600, was paid in full. Caleb sat at the kitchen table for a long time with that letter in his hands, doing math that didn't work no matter how he arranged it, and understood for the first time that his grandfather's silence about money wasn't stubbornness. It was fear, wearing stubbornness as a coat because it fit better in public. When Caleb finally raised it at dinner, Henry didn't deny it, didn't soften it, just set his fork down and said the milk prices had been bad for 3 years running, that he'd remortgaged once already after Caleb's grandmother's medical bills, and that he'd been quietly selling off equipment to buy time, the old farmall tractor, the second baler, a strip of timber rights to the county, hoping the spring planning would be good enough to catch him up. It wasn't going to be good enough. Both of them could do that math, too. Caleb sat with the number for a long time after his grandfather went up to bed that night. $18,600 wasn't an unimaginable sum in the abstract, less than a year of the salary he'd lost in Milwaukee, but stacked against a farm that had already sold off half its equipment, and a grandfather too proud to ask a single neighbor for help, it felt less like a debt and more like a verdict. He thought about his mother, who'd left this land at 19 and rarely mentioned it except at holidays, and wondered whether she even knew how close it was to being gone for good. He thought, too, about the oak stump and the bundle he'd watched his grandfather carry back from it, and found himself wondering, for the first time with something other than fear, whether whatever was buried out there had anything to do with getting them out of this. What Henry didn't mention, not once, not even glancingly, was the oak stump, or the tin box, or the bundle Caleb had watched him carry back to the house 2 mornings before. Caleb noticed the omission the way you notice a word someone very deliberately didn't say. The next obstacle arrived driving a county extension truck. A man named Roy Danforth showed up at the farm gate the following week, clipboard in hand, sent by the bank to assess the property's value ahead of the foreclosure date, and Caleb watched his grandfather go rigid in a way he'd never seen from him before. Not angry, not even really afraid, just utterly still. The stillness of a man watching a stranger walk towards something he'd spent his whole life protecting. Danforth wasn't cruel about it. He was almost apologetic, actually. The kind of man who clearly hated his own job, but he still walked the fence lines with a tablet, still photographed the barn and the equipment shed and the old oak stump at the edge of the north field, still said words like liquidation value and timeline in a voice built for delivering bad news gently. Henry stood at the edge of the field the whole time Danforth photographed the stump, arms crossed, and said nothing, but Caleb saw his jaw working like he was holding something back with his teeth. Before he left, Danforth paused at his truck door and said, almost apologetically, that he'd grown up 2 towns over, that his own grandfather had lost a place like this one in the 80s, and that he hated this part of the job more than any other part of it. It didn't change the numbers on his clipboard, but it was the first sign Caleb had that the people standing on the other side of the family's crisis weren't villains so much as other people caught inside a system none of them had built. That same week, a second obstacle showed up, this one wearing family rather than officialdom. Caleb's Aunt Denise, Henry's daughter, Caleb's mother's older sister, who'd left the farm at 19 and never once looked back, called the house for the first time in over a year, having heard through a cousin about the bank letter, and the conversation that followed was not gentle. She thought the farm should be sold outright, told her father plainly that holding on to 80 acres of debt out of pride wasn't legacy, it was stubbornness dressed up as sentiment, and that Caleb, God love him, shouldn't be enlisted to prop up a dying operation instead of building an actual life somewhere else. Henry took the call in the kitchen while Caleb pretended not to listen from the next room, and when it ended, his grandfather sat very still at the table for a long time, hands flat in front of him, before he said, mostly to himself, "She's not wrong about the numbers. She's just wrong about what the numbers are for." Denise called back 2 days later, this time asking to speak with Caleb directly, and the conversation that followed left him more unsettled than he expected. She wasn't unkind, exactly. She asked after him with real warmth, told him she was glad he had somewhere to land after Milwaukee, but underneath the warmth was a plea he hadn't been prepared for. She told him she'd watched her own mother's final years get swallowed by this farm's debts and Henry's refusal to let anyone lighten the load, and she didn't want to watch it happen to Caleb, too. "He'll let that place take everything from him before he asks for help," she said. "And I don't want it taking you next." Caleb didn't have an answer for her that day. He only knew, hanging up the phone, that her fear and his grandfather's silence were 2 sides of the same worn coin, and that somebody in this family was eventually going to have to decide which one to spend. Caleb didn't understand that sentence yet. He would understand it fully in about 4 more weeks. What he understood that same night, though, was that something in his grandfather had shifted since Danforth's visit. A new watchfulness, a habit of standing at the kitchen window looking out toward the oak stump at odd hours, as if checking it were still there. Caleb finally asked him directly, over coffee gone lukewarm, what exactly he buried out there every spring, and for the first time in 24 years, his grandfather didn't shut the gate on the question. "There's something out there that isn't just mine to explain," Henry said, turning his mug slowly on the table without drinking from it. "It was never just mine. Your great-grandfather started it before I was old enough to understand it either, and I've kept it going every spring since I was younger than you are now. And I always told myself I'd hand it over the same way it was handed to me, without a word of warning, just when it was time." He looked up at Caleb then, and something in his face had gone soft in a way Caleb had rarely seen from him. "It might be time sooner than I planned. I don't know yet. There are conditions on it. I never expected to have to think about this early." That was all he would say. But it was more than he'd said in 24 years combined, and Caleb went to bed that night with the unmistakable, electric feeling that whatever was buried at the base of that dead oak was about to stop being a secret, one careful layer at a time. The letter was in the tin box. Caleb learned that much 3 days later, not by sneaking, but because his grandfather finally, deliberately, set the box on the kitchen table between them after supper and slid it toward him with 2 fingers, the way you'd push forward something fragile. Inside, beneath a folded burlap liner gone soft with age, were envelopes, dozens of them, some so old the paper had yellowed to the color of weak tea, others crisper, more recent, all of them addressed in different hands to names Caleb half recognized from the family Bible kept in the hall closet. "To whoever finds this in 1955. To my son, when he is old enough to dig. To the next one who kneels here." Henry didn't let Caleb open any of them that night. Instead, he explained, in the plain, unhurried way he explained everything, that his own father, Caleb's great-grandfather, William Vogel, the WV, on the lid, had started the practice during the Depression, the spring after losing half the herd to a bad winter and half his hope along with it. William had buried a small tin that year with 3 things inside: a handful of seed corn from the only bin the family hadn't had to sell, a dollar bill he could not spare, and a letter to whichever Vogel found it next, telling them the farm had survived worse and would survive this too. He'd done it again the next spring, and the next. It had become a habit, then a rule, then something closer to a covenant. Every spring, a new capsule went into the ground at the base of that oak, holding seeds for whatever the family would need to plant next. A short letter written to no one in particular, and everyone in the future, and whatever small object from that year's hardship or hope seemed worth remembering. And every spring, the oldest surviving capsule, the one closest to running out its buried decade, was dug back up, read, and answered. "There's a rule," Henry said, tapping one blunt finger on the burlap. "You only get to open the ones addressed to your own generation, and only once you've dug at least one yourself. That's not superstition, and that's your great-grandfather's exact words written down, and I've never once broken it, even when I badly wanted to." Caleb asked the obvious question. What had he found this year? The thing he'd carried back to the house, wrapped in oilcloth 2 mornings before Danforth ever showed up. Henry's face did something complicated then, somewhere between grief and disbelief, and he said only, "One I wasn't ready for. It's not mine to show you yet, but it might be sooner than either of us thought, because of what's written on the outside of it." He wouldn't say more that night, but he did say this. The capsule buried in 1996, the year Caleb's mother had married and left the farm, the same year Henry's wife had first gotten sick, had a name written on its oilcloth wrapping in his late wife's handwriting. Caleb's name. It wasn't due to be dug up for another 4 years. On the schedule, William Vogel had set down 60 years before either of them were born. But given the bank letter, given the 41 days ticking down toward nothing, Henry had started to wonder whether some promises were meant to be kept early. Caleb lay awake a long time that night, turning the fact over like a stone in his pocket. His grandmother had died when he was 12, and the version of her he carried was mostly second-hand by now. A smell of talcum powder and yeast bread, a handful of photographs, a voice he could no longer quite reconstruct without effort. The idea that she had sat somewhere in this house nearly 30 years ago, already sick or already sensing she might get sick, and written something down for a grandson she'd barely met yet, did something to the ground under him that no bank letter had managed. It made the farm feel, for the first time since he'd come home, less like a burden he'd inherited by accident, and more like a conversation that had been waiting for him his whole life to finally sit down and join. Solving the bank's 41-day deadline turned out to require considerably more than a buried letter, however sentimental. Henry's first attempt was pride doing what pride does. He drove into town and asked the same bank that was foreclosing on him for an extension on the strength of 30 years of on-time payments before the last 3 bad ones, and came home 2 hours later, having been told, politely but firmly, that policy was policy, that First Farmers Trust had already extended twice, and that the district manager wasn't willing to authorize a third. Without a concrete repayment plan, the farm plainly couldn't produce in 6 weeks. Caleb watched his grandfather come through the door that afternoon, looking 10 years older than he had at breakfast, and understood that the old man's usual strategy, outlast the problem the way you outlast a bad winter, wasn't going to work this time. There wasn't a season long enough left. Between the bank's refusal and Caleb's idea came an attempt that failed quietly enough that Henry never even called it a failure out loud. He drove to the County Farm Credit Cooperative in Marshfield, hat in hand in the old-fashioned sense, hoping 30 years of membership might buy him a short-term bridge loan the regular bank wouldn't extend. The loan officer, a woman not much older than Denise, was sympathetic and thorough, and ultimately powerless. The cooperative's own reserves were stretched thin after a hard year for half the farms in the county, and she could offer him, at most, a fraction of what he needed, on a timeline slower than the 41 days he had left. Henry thanked her anyway, the way his generation thanked people, even when the news was bad, and drove home with the radio off the whole way, which Caleb had learned by then was how his grandfather carried disappointment when he didn't want it seen. The second attempt was Caleb's idea, and it cost him something to suggest it. He'd kept, from the Milwaukee job, a decent laptop and an even better understanding of how small local businesses built themselves an online presence, and he spent 3 days photographing the farm, the barn at dawn, the cattle in the near pasture, Henry's weathered hands working a length of fence wire, and built a page selling advanced shares of the fall harvest directly to families in 3 counties, cutting out the wholesale buyers who'd been squeezing margins for years. It was not on its own going to cover $18,000. Caleb spent those first 4 days learning things he hadn't expected to need: how to write about the farm in a way that didn't sound like a plea, how to price a share of a harvest that hadn't been planted yet, how to answer patiently the same 3 questions from a dozen strangers who'd never bought food directly from the person who grew it before. But it brought in $1,100 in the first 4 days, and more importantly, it brought in something Henry hadn't expected: neighbors. The Ostrander family, 2 farms over, who Henry hadn't spoken more than 10 words to in a decade over an old boundary dispute, showed up with 2 of their sons and a flatbed to help repair a collapsing section of the equipment shed roof, free of charge because Mrs. Ostrander had seen the harvest share page and remembered out loud whose granddaughter had once carried her own mother's casseroles across that same disputed fence line during a bad flu season 20 years back. Henry didn't know how to accept that kind of help gracefully. He accepted it anyway, stiffly, with his jaw tight the whole afternoon, and Caleb understood that this, too, was its own kind of harvest. It still wasn't enough. 2 weeks before the deadline, with the online shares stalled around $3,800 and no clear path to the rest, Henry did something Caleb hadn't seen coming. He went out to the oak stump alone on a day that wasn't the last Saturday of April and dug up the newest capsule he'd buried only weeks before, the one meant to hold until some decades from now. He brought it inside and set it on the table, and for the first time in Caleb's memory, opened one that wasn't due, breaking his own father's rule with his own 2 hands. Inside wasn't money. William Vogel's covenant had never been about money, not really, and Henry seemed almost relieved to confirm that to himself as much as to Caleb. What was inside was a second, older letter that had been resealed inside this year's capsule. A note from 1988, written by Henry's own father, describing a nearly identical crisis. A bad debt, a looming deadline, a family on the edge of losing the North 40 for the very first time. William's advice, 38 years old and still legible, was blunt and unsentimental. Sell what you can live without before you sell what you can't. The land remembers who worked it. It doesn't remember who owned the paperwork. That night, Henry made the hardest call of the whole spring, not to the bank, but to Aunt Denise, admitting for the first time that she'd been right about at least part of it. That pride had kept him from selling the last 100 acres of standing timber on the property's northern edge 2 years earlier, when the offer had first come in, because that timber had been in the family since William's day, and Henry couldn't stand the idea of being the generation that let it go. He sold it now at a worse price than he'd have gotten before, for exactly enough to clear the debt with less than $900 to spare. It wasn't the storybook ending Caleb had half hoped for. It was something more honest than that. His grandfather trading one kind of inheritance to protect another, and knowing out loud which one mattered more. What was left, once the debt was cleared and the timber trucks had come and gone, was the letter with Caleb's name on it, still sitting unopened on the kitchen table, 4 years ahead of its schedule, and entirely, terrifyingly his to open now if he wanted. Caleb didn't open it right away. He carried it around in his jacket pocket for 2 full days first, the oilcloth gone soft and pliable from 30 years underground. Terrified in a way he couldn't fully explain that whatever his grandmother had written to him before he was even born might ask something of him he wasn't ready to give. Henry didn't push. He only said, the second evening, that his own father's letters had never once asked anything of him that he hadn't already, secretly, wanted to be asked. He opened it at the kitchen table, in the same chair he'd sat in as a boy asking about the tin box on the mantel. Eleanor's handwriting was smaller and neater than he remembered from the one Christmas card he still had of hers, and the letter was short, 4 paragraphs, dated the spring before she got sick, 6 years before Caleb was even born. She wrote about a grandson she would never live to meet the way she wanted to, guessing at who he might become based only on family stories and her own stubborn hope, guessing wrong about some things and, unnervingly, exactly right about others. She wrote that farms like this one didn't survive because the men who ran them were unbreakable. They survived because every generation buried something for the next one, to find right when they needed it most. And that faith, more than fences or bank loans, was the actual crop this land had always been growing. She asked him, whoever he'd turned out to be by the time he read this, to bury something himself before he decided whether to stay or go, because the question wouldn't answer itself honestly until his hands were in that dirt. Caleb sat with that letter a long time. It didn't hand him a plan for his life the way he'd half-childishly hoped it might. It handed him something quieter and, in the end, more useful. Permission to stop treating this spring as a layover on the way back to some other version of his future, and to instead ask, honestly, whether the future he'd been chasing in Milwaukee had ever actually been his own idea, or just the version of success that seemed easiest to explain to people at parties. He didn't decide that day. He told his grandfather, honestly, that he didn't know yet whether he was staying past the planting season, and Henry, to his enormous credit, didn't push either, just nodded and said that not deciding wasn't the same as failing to decide, and that the ground would still be here whenever Caleb was ready to put something in it. What Caleb did know, walking out to the oak stump alone at dawn a few mornings later, spade in hand for the first time in his life, was that he had something worth burying. He'd spent the previous night writing it. Not a grand statement, just an honest one, addressed to whoever in this family needed it next, admitting how close he'd come to treating this land as a burden instead of an inheritance, and how wrong he'd been about that. He wrapped it, the way he'd watched his grandfather do it his whole life without understanding why, in a scrap of oilcloth, tied with the same kind of twine from the same drawer in the barn that had held it for 3 generations. He included a handful of seed corn from this year's harvest share crop, the one that had saved the farm as much as the timber sale had. And he included, on impulse, the county extension man's business card, Roy Danforth's, the one who'd walked the fence lines with such visible discomfort, as a small private reminder that even the people sent to take something from you sometimes turn out to be decent, and that the line between threat and neighbor was thinner than fear liked to admit. Henry came out while Caleb was digging, not to help. His hands weren't steady enough for that kind of work anymore, and both of them knew it now without needing to say it. But to stand at the edge of the hole, the way he had every spring of Caleb's whole life, except this time, he wasn't alone at it. Your great-grandfather figured something out that took me 60 years to really understand, Henry said, watching Caleb lower the bundle into the ground. The point was never really the letters. It was making sure nobody in this family ever had to face the worst spring of their life feeling like they were the only one who ever had one. Caleb covered the hole and tamped the earth flat the way he'd watched his grandfather do it 100 times from the tree line, and found, to his own surprise, that his eyes were wet in a way that had nothing to do with the wind. He thought about the version of himself who'd crouched in the brush weeks earlier, terrified his grandfather was hiding something shameful or broken, and understood now how badly he'd misread the shape of what he was watching. It hadn't been a man hiding a secret. It had been a man keeping a promise so old it had outlived the fear that started it. The tin box went back on the mantel that evening, but it didn't sit the same way anymore. Not a locked door Caleb wasn't allowed through, but a threshold he'd finally crossed on his own 2 feet. His grandmother's reading glasses were still on the windowsill above the sink, and Caleb noticed a few days later that his own hand had started resting there a beat too long while he did the dishes, the same way his grandfather's always had, without either of them ever discussing why. Henry moved a little slower these days, sat down on the porch steps a little more often than he used to, and had started, without announcement, teaching Caleb where the old fuse box breakers were, which fields drained poorly after heavy rain, and how to read a sky that meant frost was coming for the seedlings. Neither of them called it a handover. It was one anyway. Denise called again in early summer, and this time, when she asked Caleb whether he was still planning on leaving once the season ended, he found he could answer her honestly for the first time. Not with a plan exactly, but with the truth that leaving no longer felt like the thing he was working toward. Caleb stayed past the planting season. He stayed through the first cutting of hay, and then he simply stopped counting the days he told himself he was allowed to stay, because the question his grandmother's letter had asked him had, somewhere in the digging, quietly answered itself. He kept the online harvest share page running, expanded it a little each month, and used part of what it earned to finally repair the section of roof the Ostranders had only patched, and Henry led him, which was its own kind of blessing from a man who'd spent 30 years refusing help from anyone. The following April, on the last Saturday of the month, Caleb woke before first light without needing a note left on the kitchen table to tell him where to go. His grandfather was already dressed, tin box under one arm, waiting by the door instead of slipping out alone the way he had every spring for 60 years before this one. They walked out to the oak stump together in the fog, and this time there was no brush to hide behind, no fear pulling Caleb's feet to a stop at the tree line. He knelt in the dirt beside his grandfather, and together, for the first time since William Vogel had started it in the coldest spring of his life, two Vogels dug at the same time. One capsule coming up to be answered, one going down to wait its turn. The oldest promise on the farm, quietly, faithfully, renewing itself in the hands of the boy who'd once been so afraid of what it meant.